Alrighty, welcome back. I apologize again for the severe confusion that I caused in which rooms are where. Hopefully that has all shaken out. I probably couldn't be more excited about this next session because I would really probably have to say that my absolute single most favorite website on the internet is Flickr, the photo sharing website and community. It has really transformed my life for the better in the 19 or 20 months that I have been on it. And we're going to take a look kind of behind the curtain in this next session and take a look at some of the magic that goes into into what makes Flickr work. It's not only an exquisite site in its outward concept in photo sharing and community building, but it is a tour de force of modern day quote-unquote Web 2.0 development. Here to talk to us about it is Flickr's lead engineer. He is Cal Henderson. He has been with Flickr since the beginning, since the Ludicorp days in Vancouver, BC. He is originally from somewhere considerably further east than that, as you will probably detect. And he's going to talk to us about Flickr and a case study in rich internet applications development. This is our last session until lunch. The first session after lunch begins at 2 o'clock. So without any further ado, please say good morning to Cal Henderson.
Is this thing on? Okay. I'm, as Jim said, I'm Cal Henderson. I'm actually, my job title is the Flickr architect. I'm not a designer at all. The other people speaking today and tomorrow and the day after are a little more well-known than me, Jeff and Kelly and Dave and Doug. But I'm kind of a little more behind the scenes. I was the principal engineer for Flickr. I was the only engineer when Flickr started. I'm now the architect of a small team of engineers, and I do middle and back-end engineering. But today I'm going to be talking a little more about front-end engineering, talking a bit about AJAX and a bit about Web 2.0 technologies, and kind of the layers somewhere in between design and middleware, at the kind of front-end programming layer and a little bit of server stuff. I currently work for Yahoo Inc. down in the valley here in the Bay Area, and Yahoo owns Flickr now. It's a Yahoo property. So Flickr.com is the website. Who's heard of Flickr or used Flickr? Okay, who hasn't heard of Flickr? Okay, so there's at least a couple of people. It's Flickr, no E.com, and it's a photo sharing community. It's reasonably large in size. It's not the hugest site on the interweb. There's a couple of million users now, maybe 2.5 million. Over 93 million photos last night. It's probably about 94 million this morning. There'll be 100 million in a couple of weeks, maybe in a week's time. That actually represents a massive 368 terabytes of hard disk space, or 376,832 gigabytes. So that's a fair amount of disk space that all of these photos are stored on, these 93 million photos and growing. I'll tell you a little bit about, for the people not so familiar with Flickr and who haven't been members for a couple of years, a bit about how Flickr came to be as it is today. The company that built Flickr previous to being acquired by Yahoo is a company called Ludicorp. There's still a company website at ludicorp.com, despite the fact we're not really a company anymore. Now we've been bought. But Flickr started out, or rather the company started out, building a massively multiplayer online game called The Game Never Ending, or GNE, at gne.net, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. And it was a real-time online gaming environment where people would, it was social network based, so you would add all of your friends in the game and you could wander around the world, and you had a home and you collected paper from trees, and it was a strange currency, and you traded paper and picked up objects and traded other objects in the game, and you could make things and do cooking and exchange things and dance and stab people with marshmallow daggers, and a very strange variety of things. And this was the only product that the company had. And then a year and a half, 2 years into development, the company was running out of money. There wasn't a whole lot of funding around because it was early 2000s. And so we decided to take the core technology platform that we had, which was a real-time messaging server for real-time environments, and apply it to some other sites so that we could just quickly put something out, make a little bit of money, and get back to the game, which was core to the business. And so we created something called Flickr. We launched it February the 10th, 2004 at ECCON in San Diego. And the original idea behind Flickr was a real-time Flash application where you could chat with friends. It was kind of like an instant message environment with group chats as well, kind of somewhere between IM and IRC. And you could drag photos into conversations, and they'd pop up on people's screens, and you could say, here, look at a photo I've just taken, or here, look at a photo I found on the web, and have conversations around photos and kind of annotate them with notes and point out a region of a photo and talk about them. Flickr's changed a little bit since then. We've come 2 years on. In fact, we are going to be 2 next week, or the week, next week. So on Saturday, February 11th, there's a Flickr party. I believe it's in San Francisco. It's at the Adaptive Path offices, I think, Jeff Veen's company, and there will be birthday cake. And anyone who uses Flickr is invited. So come along next week if you're going to be in the area. So the Flickr company was the Flickr company Ludicorp was based in Vancouver, BC, which is not in America, although it's on the border. This is it's Canadian, although you might be able to tell I'm not Canadian. I'm, as Jim says, from a lot further east. So we were originally in Vancouver. We moved down the coast down to San Francisco, where we are now. But I mean, Flickr used to be about a real-time photo sharing app for the first few months anyway, where you drag photos to each other. It's kind of relied on the idea of lots of people being online at once that you knew. And when we started Flickr, maybe we had 100 users and then 1,000. At any one time, we had as many as 7 or 8 people online at once to exchange photos, which is kind of useless. If you have 7 out of 1,000 people, it's unlikely that it'll be the people you know it's very unlikely you'll be online at the same time as your friends or anyone in your family. And so that idea didn't really work. Perhaps it'll work again now that we have millions of users. But it kind of relied on people being online at the same time. So we're having a bit of a problem with that. There was a core set of users who would kind of be online 24 hours a day. I'm sure you're familiar with this. If any of your sites have a little bit of a cult following with a few users who are just there all of the time. But for everyone else, it wasn't working out so well. So we took a really revolutionary step, or not actually revolutionary at all, of putting photos on web pages. And this is where Flickr started to change. We weren't really changing the world. It's not as if people hadn't figured out that you could put a photo on a web page and people could come and see them yet at this point. But this is core to the idea of Flickr. And here we have a photo on a web page. This is a photo I took the other day of a remote control helicopter. That's so cool. So I think this is called the Blade CX. They're little indoor remote control helicopters, and this is us flying one in the office. So this is the core photo page. It's kind of the very core page of Flickr, although it's not the front page. Here you see I have my photo. My username on Flickr is Bees. So it shows that these are my photos over here. It says I have 3,295. This photo happens to be in a set called Helicopters. I've taken quite a lot of photos. They're really awesome. So I can see my photos. I can view a slideshow of my photos about helicopters. And we have tags down here. I'll talk about tags in a bit more in a while. And people can comment on them. And I can do all kinds of cool things with the toolbar along the top of the photo, like add notes, which I might talk about later, put it in groups and sets, and blog it, as Kelly was trying to do earlier. I'm sure that usually works. And I can order prints of it and rotate it and all that kind of stuff. So the individual photo page is very core, is the kind of core of Flickr. So we have almost 100 million of these photo pages where people upload photos. So just do a little bit of a feature tour of Flickr for those not familiar with it, or for people familiar with only parts of it. We're not really revolutionary in putting photos on web pages and allowing people to look at them. There's lots of other services that do this. There's lots that have been doing it for a lot longer than us. There's 10-year-old services. I will forget all of the names now, but PhotoNet has been around for a long time, and Photolog, and other ones with photo in it. Kodak Easy Share Gallery, which used to be called oPhoto, and Snapfish, and other services like that, which allow you to upload your photos and print them and maybe share them with your family. So how does Flickr differ from this, and why is Flickr important and interesting and all Web 2.0 and exciting? So there's kind of 3 core concepts to Flickr and how Flickr differs. We're social network based, we have collaborative metadata, and there's community aggregation. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those 3. So we're social network based in that because of our game heritage, the social network was very core to an online sharing environment. But it's still very core to the idea of Flickr now, that I have a list of friends and family contacts, and I can classify them as whether they're my friends or happen to be related to me. And these people, these relationships, everything else through Flickr can go through these relationships. So I can say, these bunch of photos are only from this group of friends, or these photos are only for my family, or these photos are for everyone, or these photos are just for this person. So social network is at the core of it. So we allow different permission levels, but via a fairly simple system that people seem to understand. So when we first started looking at a permission system for photo privacy, when we very first started, we only had public photos. But when we were looking for a permission system, we looked at the way lots of other sites do it, and they'll allow you to build complex permission set groups and access control lists and kind of very complex ways of organizing how people access your data and privacy levels. And then so you can get very complex systems with very complex rules, like the Windows file system permissions. And is there anyone in the room who understands completely Windows file system permissions with all the thousands of checkboxes per file? There are some people, but they read very big books, and they're very nice people. But so we looked at how other people were doing it, and so we looked at LiveJournal, which was the really interesting way, really interesting model. There's two ways there's two levels of privacy in LiveJournal. There's public, or there's share it with my list of friends, and that works really well. Most people don't need many levels of privacy, and so we have about 4, but we more or less have 2. It's public, or it's shared with my network of friends, and then your network of friends governs everything else on the site. So we're social network based, which was quite a big difference at the time. And then, based on my social network, I can look at views based around my network. So this page just shows me latest photos from people who I count as my friends or family, and I can also look at latest photos from people who I have on my contact list. So just everyone I say I know. So this just shows latest photos from my colleague up there, or a friend of mine, or other friends of mine, or people in my family. So, for instance, down at the bottom, Anti-Mega, that's Chris, who lives in Finland. So I can look at this happens to be the Finnish, I think, election results, which the election was yesterday. So I can look at the latest photos, and I see everything that's going on in my friends' lives. So the stuff that I actually care about. So views from the site are built on top of the social network, because social network is core to how it works, how the site works. Okay, next down, we were talking about of the kind of 3 core features that make us interesting. On top of social network, we have collaborative metadata, which I'll get onto a bit later, but collaborative metadata and community aggregation. So, unfortunately, a lot of my slides Jeff has already shown in his keynote, because they happen to be screenshots of Flickr. So here again is our tags page. What's perhaps interesting to note is that all of Jeff's screenshots were from probably about 12 months ago, because the site looked a little bit different up at the top. But what's interesting to note is that we haven't changed anything at all on this page. Otherwise, it still looks exactly the same. Although the hot tags are no longer Burger King. They're now Trafalgar, Regent's Park, Chinese New Year, obviously. So we show as Jeff was saying, we do a bottom-up taxonomy. So we haven't created any categories at all. People tag stuff, and structure comes out of that. And we do some kind of complex analysis at the back end, which tells us what the hot tags are. And those are tags which have previously been unpopular and have become popular over the last 24 hours or over the last week, as well as aggregating what's been popular over all time. So the most popular tags is the view at the bottom in what's been now called a tag cloud, which is just a list of tags where the more popular ones are larger. So we use this the metadata and kind of community aggregation to cut across the whole data set. So if we imagine Flickr as a huge big cloud of everything, we want to find interesting ways to cut through it and create a view. So the usual ways in which a photo site might cut through it is basically by user, you would see all of those users' photos, or by user by time. So I can see your photos from February 2005, or perhaps your photos that you put in an album. So we're thinking about interesting ways that we can cut across the data set in a different direction. So we don't just care about by user anymore, although that is interesting. You know, I might want to look at the photos from my friend, but much more interesting is photos from my friends, all of them together, or photos on a particular subject. I don't care who particularly took these photos of San Francisco. I'm just looking for photos of San Francisco, so I go and look at the tag, and this shows me the most recent photos taken by everyone in the system that have been tagged with San Francisco. So it's by using community aggregation, by aggregating stuff together from everyone, we create new interesting views which other photo sites at the time weren't doing. And then, again, one of my slides that Jeff's already shown is the clusters page, where we then drill down further and we try and infer relationships just out of the sparse metadata that people have given us. So they tag photos with a few words, and we can notice that often when people tag something in San Francisco, they tag it with Bridge and Golden Gate, so we can infer that that's a cluster of photos. And all of this aggregation isn't done editorially, it's just done by using various algorithms. So we notice that often photos will have these groups of tags together, so we say these are probably related in some way. And so we get some good clusters for San Francisco. We get the Golden Gate Bridge, we get general city shots, we get stuff of the baseball and the Giants Park, and we get graffiti. And those are the 4 big clusters for San Francisco. And this is all bottom-up stuff. And it's not just San Francisco and whatever tag Jeff was showing. There's thousands and thousands of clusters. For every kind of tag for which people often use, we can infer relationships out of them and create really interesting views through the data that we hadn't previously thought about and that people might not think they want to see. But if I then go and look at photos of San Francisco, it kind of gives me hints of what I can go and look at. Talk a little bit about how Flickr works, just a little bit at the back end and at the lower levels. It's powered by a bunch of hardware in Texas and Virginia. Since we moved to Yahoo, a few hundred servers doing various roles. It's a little more complicated, but can be broken down into 3 chunks of kind of roles that machines do. We have web serving, so they're serving of pages, and those are our application servers, and they process web pages and serve out the HTML. We have photo storage and serving, which is obviously not usually a big role for many applications, but for Flickr that's pretty core, and there's some interesting problems around that. And then we have databases, which store the relationship between everything and aren't exposed to users, but are exposed through the other couple of layers. So that's kind of the Flickr architecture in a small nutshell. We have the interweb, and then we have web servers and storage servers on the front end, and they talk to users, and then we have database servers at the back end that kind of infer all of the relationships and store everything important in the relationships between our data and our data itself. More interesting perhaps for designers, is the stack of layers that we have in terms of software. So Jeff talked about Jesse's 5 or 6 S-flavored layers, which are the design and interaction layers. And then we also have back-end layers in a diagram that we're not going to show, but we can think about the hardware layers as separate layers. So we have hardware layers, and we have software layers, and we have interface layers, and everything's layered, and it's wonderful. So the core of how we build Flickr and how we build modern applications tends to be in software layers in an arrangement something like this, if we have an AJAX-based app. So we have our application logic at the bottom, which in our case is written in PHP, but can be written in any of these server-side technologies. You can write it in C if you're in a big old-school company. You write it in JSP, ASP.NET, whatever. And then on top of our common application logic layer, which decides kind of how Flickr functions, how we store a photo to the database, or how we pull out tags, or how we pull out a certain view on photos. We set on top page logic on the one hand, which again in our case is written in PHP, and that decides how user flows through pages work, and that kind of thing, the interaction, what particular elements we're going to pull out to put on a single page. And alongside the page logic, sitting on top of the application logic, we have an API, application programming interface. So the API, which allows a computer-based interface to our code and to our workings, and allows people to perform methods upon our data, that sits on top of a common layer of application logic. So we just write our application once, and we present a couple of different interfaces to it. On top of our page logic, we then sit a templating layer which outputs our HTML with lovely CSS, and it's probably XHTML, it's all standards compliant and all that stuff. In the case of Flickr, we use Smarty, but if you're using ASP, you use ASP or some kind of framework. It doesn't particularly matter. But on top of the API, then between the API and the client layer, we have AJAX or something similar to it. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about AJAX, and then there's a whole bunch of talks after me over the next 3 days, about AJAX and how wonderful it is. So we talk both through templates and AJAX to our client, to the client, which is the browser, or mobile browser, or whichever device we happen to be talking to. But really, all of these layers in the middle are just for communicating between, again, our browser and our core application logic at the bottom, which is always one big monolithic thing. Not monolithic, but you can view it in such a way. So I'll talk about AJAX for a while. What's it all about? Stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It was named by Jesse James Garrett, who's already been bought up. He works for Adaptive Path, Jeff's company. He named it in February 2005. He wrote an article on the Adaptive Path website. But really, it was just putting a name to a technology that had been around for a while, or at least it's not so much AJAX isn't a technology, but rather a technique, and a combination of existing technologies and just kind of a methodology. So it had often previously been called remoting. Big high-profile apps which used it before the article on AJAX. Google Maps uses it for its whole scrolling abouty interface. Gmail uses it heavily. The Google Reader, although the Google Reader came out after that paper, I think. Flickr used AJAX before that. AJAX has been around probably 5 or 6 years longer. It kind of first started happening right when the version 4 browsers, when you started having JavaScript on the client side. So it's been around for a little while, but it's recently gained a lot more notoriety through Jesse's paper and through gaining actual interesting use in applications like Flickr and stuff like Gmail and Google Maps. When people first started using AJAX or AJAX-like techniques with asynchronous loading, it was with things like loading a script or loading a different page into a hidden iframe or writing script tags into the document, which is still a valid technique for certain kinds of things. But we've come a little bit further when Microsoft created XML HTTP request in 1998, which I guess would have been IE5 when IE 5.0 first came out. And everyone else, as in all of the other major browser vendors, have followed suit and created more or less compatible XML HTTP request support. So there's support in Mozilla and Firefox, there's support in Safari, in Opera, in the latest version of iCab. And it's fairly standard, although this wasn't a standard created by any standards body. It was something that Microsoft just created along with their browser, and everyone else thought it was a fairly good idea and has more or less followed along with it. Kind of the latest interesting technology in the field has been JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation, which was created sometime in 2005 by Douglas Crockford, who's now at Yahoo. And it's just a format for sending data across the wire, and formatting stuff as if it were JavaScript syntax, as opposed to using XML or something else which is a bit tricky to parse. Something that's interesting about AJAX is that the name is a little bit misleading. So it's asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It would be a bit rubbish if it was just called A, which is what's core to it. So it's asynchronous is the point. It doesn't necessarily have to be JavaScript, because you could be using VB script on the client side, or any other client-side scripting language. Not that there really are any others, but you could do it. You could do it using Flash, and XML isn't important either. While lots of AJAX stuff started off using XML, XML can be a bit of a pain to parse on the client side, and there's no particular reason why you have to send it across. So lots of AJAX stuff nowadays is being done in JSON as the data format. So AJAX has just become a term which doesn't necessarily mean JavaScript and XML, but just means asynchronous data in some form between the server and the client. So the AJAX model is based around a round trip, different to the user clicking, loading another page, as Jeff's square wave diagram showed. So The usual AJAX round trip is the user initiates some kind of action. Maybe they click on a link or type something in, click a button, drag an area. And the browser makes a background request using XML HTTP request, background request to the server. Server does its thing, does some processing, talks to a database, and sends a response back, maybe in JSON, maybe in XML, maybe in some other proprietary format. JavaScript in the browser executes to handle the response, and it gets executed asynchronously. So it will be executed as soon as the response comes back, and the browser doesn't have to sit around waiting for it. The browser can be doing other things. And then this response comes in and gets processed, and then the response is displayed somehow to the user. So if they'd clicked a button, they'll then get a response back on the screen. Actually, the first and last steps aren't important, and they can be knocked out, one or both of them, and the round trip still makes sense. So the user initiates the action. That's not necessarily needed. You can have some kind of situation in which every 5 seconds you go and use an AJAX request to pull data from the server and display it to the client. And that's perfectly valid usage. Or you can cut out the response display. Every time the user enters some text, every couple of seconds it will go and save it. So, and you don't need to tell the user you're doing this, but you're just saving state as the user's editing. Or you can cut out both completely. So if you want to do some kind of user tracking, like you care where the cursor is on the page, you save the response off to the server, you send the request to the server using AJAX, and you don't have to wait for it to come back, and you don't have to display anything to the user. So the part that matters about the round trip is sending a request. The server does its thing in its own time, and then it comes back to the browser, and you can do some kind of processing, whether that's showing the response to the user or storing data, or maybe you don't even care about the response, and just the request and getting the data off to the server was the important thing. So all of the browsers, or all of the modern contemporary browsers support this kind of tech now. So it's really easy. It's not really easy. Luckily, all of the browsers implement XML HTTP requests slightly differently. They're all more or less the same, but there are subtle differences, like how you instantiate the object and the arguments you can pass to it and the different status code it can respond with. But generally, we avoid any of the problems with the differences between them by wrapping the implementations in some kind of simple library. There are a whole bunch of these simple free libraries out there which just wrap around the object and allow you one method to create the object regardless of the browser, and a single method to send the request and a single method to get the response back. So whichever the browser is, we know exactly how to make a request, and we know exactly what format the response will come back in. There's a very interesting URL which popped up a couple of days ago of somebody who's built a very large, not a compliance test suite, but a test suite to show capabilities of the different browsers, especially with regard to how they handle different parts of HTTP. So like different status code redirects, like 301s, 302s, 307s, and the kind of things they do around those, and the caching around them as well. I don't have the URL right here, but it'll be up on my website, which I'll give the link to at the end. And you can take any browser there, and it will show you the exact capabilities around redirects and HTTP headers and such. But basically, every browser does it slightly differently in such a way enough to be a little bit annoying if you're trying to do anything tricky. So we want to abstract all that away, wrap it up in some kind of object, which gives us a really consistent interface so that we don't have to care about which browser we're developing for. This isn't the early 2000s or late 90s again, and we'd rather just write one piece of code and deploy it and have it work everywhere. We don't want to do if browser is this, do this kind of work, especially not all the way through our code. We've got other things to worry about without having to be browser compatible. So typically, all of the Flickr code is developed on Firefox, and in such a way that we know it's going to work on PCIe and Safari. I'm not the core front-end engineer, but I think he currently uses Firefox. And Flickr is known to work on Opera and PCIe and Firefox and Safari and iCab. So once we do the initial work of abstracting away the difference, we can then just get on with writing the application and doing the bits that are interesting instead of worrying about browser stuff. And we generally care less about how, once we get building an application and we're not just building the tools and frameworks around it, we generally care less about how any of the implementation works and just about how we can get things done. So we can, more than just abstracting away the idea of creating an XML RPC XML HTTP request object and requesting and responding, we can abstract away everything in the request-response cycle and hide the protocol as well. We don't really care whether we're talking to a SOAP server or an XML RPC server or some kind of REST server or a JSON service. All we care about is that we can make a request and get a response. In fact, at some point, the Flickr backend switched from using XML RPC to REST, but we don't care writing the front-end code, and none of it had to be changed. It's just that small chunk of the interface library. So we just want to pass off a list of request parameters, and we want to get a response object back as a JavaScript object, just with the data we want. We don't really care about what the transport is, so that's the first thing we abstract away, so that we just have this simple library where we call a method and get a response. And it's all just in pure JavaScript, and we don't have to do XML parsing in there. We don't pass around XML source between different bits of the application, because that would get confusing. We'd have to have parsing code everywhere. We don't care about that stuff, so we can abstract it away early and just pass around simple objects. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about how we debug AJAX applications, because it's a lot harder to debug an app built around AJAX than it is around a static web page. A static web page, we just make some changes, refresh, the page is either there or it's not. Fairly straightforward. When there's a problem in an AJAX app, the first thing is we don't know whether it's the client or the server that's at fault, especially if we're developing the server alongside the client and we're not using somebody else's fail-safe service which has already been developed a year ago and has a big test suite around it. We don't know whether, if something goes wrong, maybe the client code's at fault, maybe we're just getting the wrong response from the server. But more than that, you can't see what's happening. Unlike when we click on a link to load a page in a browser, we can see that there's progress, and then we can view source once the page comes in, and we can see whether the page came in correctly. We can see what's going to the browser. With an AJAX app, we can't see what's happening because it's going on in the background. I mean, that's the nature of the beast. So we're going to need some kind of special tools to help us debug AJAX apps, because we need to see what's going over the wire. We need to see what data is being sent between the client and server, what kind of requests we're making, and what kind of response we're getting back. And more than that, we need to see what our code's doing. We need to see, once it receives that data, how's it parsing it, what kind of events are firing, what's going on inside the guts of the browser. So the simplest way to see what's going on in the browser is just to print stuff out, echo it out to the screen. And that's what the alert function was built for. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the alert function. Pops up a little dialog. So there we go. I'm debugging my app. It says, received response from server. And then, some kind of loop happens, and I have 1,000 dialogues, and I'm having to click OK, and I'll have to cancel them all before I can close the browser and refresh the page. I'm sure this is a situation anyone trying to debug JavaScript-based app has got into before. You just get dialog boxes everywhere. It takes 10 minutes to get rid of them all. Maybe if you're stuck in a loop, you'll never be able to get rid of them all. You'll have to Control-Alt-Delete, kill off Firefox, and reboot it. It's a little bit irritating. So alert isn't always the best solution. If we're just talking about dumping raw data out and we want to be able to see it, apart from the fact that an alert dialog box, we can't put a whole page of XML in it because you just can't read it. Apart from the fact that we can't put a lot of data in it, we can't have repeating messages, because if something goes wrong, then we can't get out of that situation. So a good way to get around this problem is to create a debugging window or area inside the application, and we can dump our data into that. So when we're debugging the Flickr app, we have a debug console which opens up at the bottom of the page and creates a scrollable region which is kind of pre-formatted so that we can read text easily and see if it lines up. And we create a very simple function inside the code called debug or something like that, which we pass a string and it just dumps it out to this area so we can see it. And we can keep dumping strings, and all it will do is make the scroll bar, which isn't shown here, but we could have a scroll bar on the side of the debug console area, which then just scrolls as it gets longer, and it automatically scrolls down to the bottom so we can see the latest content. And that's very simple. We just abstract that away inside a single debug function. And in fact, we go a little bit further, and we create a couple of handlers inside that debug function. So if we pass it a snippet of XML, it knows how to pretty print it as XML that's just quite readable. Or if you pass it a JavaScript object, it knows how to show us all the properties of that object to allow us to debug things fast. We just pass them to the debug function. They get dumped out. And the more detail, the better, because we can scroll through it and we can search through it in Firefox as well. So we're not left with dialog boxes all over the screen. And one of the ways which we usually use this is we'll put debug statements in our code, and we'll have a debug flag at the top of the initiation library at the top of our init function, which gets called on load. And then when we're on our development server or in our staging server, we can turn on debugging. We don't have to add anything extra into the code because all of our debug statements are already there, and it dumps everything out to the console. But then when we push our site to production, we just turn the debug flag off. The debug function, when it gets called, just does nothing. So we keep these functions inside our code all the time. We can flip on debugging, and then it just dumps a whole load of stuff out to the console. And so by default, when developing anything at interesting points in the functions, we can dump out the results. So whenever I go onto the development version of Flickr, I can always see the whole dialogue between the client and server as it's going. And that makes debugging a lot easier. So that's kind of a development attitude, is to always write debugging points into your code so that you're always dumping out the important request and response cycles or important values so that you can just turn it on easily. You often watch developers who will, when they have a problem, they'll add a whole bunch of debug stuff into their code. Then as soon as the problem's fixed, they'll go back and remove it all, they move along a bit, and then they get another problem, put lots of debug statements back in until they've fixed it, and then remove them. And this is a cycle which takes time and wastes time. And if there's always points in your code which you're going to want to be able to debug, especially with AJAX apps, it's the requests you're making and the responses you're getting back. The most important things. You should have a simple way to turn those on and see exactly what's going on. So we generally care about we really care about the data that's going over the wire, especially with AJAX apps. We care about the request and the response cycle. So if we can somehow see the HTTP traffic, we can make sure we're sending the right requests and make sure the server is acting as we expect. So it's returning the responses that we're expecting it to return. It's saying what we think it will, and it's not spewing errors all over the place. An error that's pretty difficult to pick up is if your server is returning some kind of response which makes invalid XML, and then your XML parser in your browser just skips over that bit so you never see it when you're passing your response. So you quite often need to look at the raw pre-passed response to see if there are any problems. So there's an awesome program called, I'm not sure if it's said Ethereal or Ethereal. This is obviously Ethernet and Ethereal. It lets us grab and analyze network traffic and get it from ethereal.com. It runs on Windows, Linux. It also runs on the Mac if you have Think installed. So it basically run anywhere. It runs on all the different Linuxes and on Solaris and all those kind of platforms. Runs everywhere. It looks a little bit like this. So this is after I've done a capture of the traffic running on my local machine, just as I was editing the title of a photo on Flickr. In the top window with all the green bits is a list of all the Ethernet frames that it's captured, different frames, and so I scroll down to this HTTP one, which is a response from the server. And then the second window down gives me the kind of structured response that came back from the server. And I go down, look through the frame header and through the TCP header, and the HTTP header, and then I get down to the actual response, and it breaks it out as XML. And in the very bottom window, I can see the raw bytes that the server sent back. So I can see, I got an XML header, and then I got a tag called RSP, static was OK, photo ID. So I can look at the raw response, and if I scrolled up in the top window and chose the two messages above it, the one that says post services rest, I'd be able to look at the request that my client made. So I can look into the request in detail. But this is a little bit nerdy, this app. So it's showing me stuff like TCP acknowledgement sequences and kind of packet sequence stuff and TCP and IP headers, which just aren't very interesting for most people developing AJAX apps. We assume that the network's working. We have to assume at least that some level of our tech is we're going to be able to ignore. And we care about the request and the response from the server. We don't really care about how the network works. So that's a little bit too much sometimes, just for general debugging of apps. But also the thing that kind of sucks about it is it's a read-only tool. We can only look at stuff after the fact it's happened, and if we then want to make a change, we'll have to go back to the server, maybe change some code, or talk to our programmers who are doing the server-side work and say, hey, this isn't working, this is the kind of response we'd like, and we'd like to see what our client does when we send this kind of code. What would be really cool is if we could intercept this request and say, now, if only if I change this value 1 to 2, how will the client act? And then you can easily test different scenarios and see what's going to happen if the server sends an unexpected response or a slightly different response without having to modify what's actually going on the server. There's this fantastic app called Fiddler. It's half written by Microsoft and half by, I think, an ex-Microsoft engineer. You can get it at fiddlertool.com. In fact, all of these URLs in the slides, and the slides themselves you can get off my website. There'll be a URL at the end, so you don't need to write them all down now. It's a free app, but it runs on Windows only. So if you're a Mac engineer, unfortunately, you can't use Fiddler. It works best with IE and has close integration with IE, but will also work with other browsers. It's just a little bit trickier to get it fired up and to capture right. So mainly for IE, and I tend to switch to IE if I need to use Fiddler for anything. And after running a capture session, the window looks a bit like this, and the window on the left just shows requests I've made and the responses I got, the URL. So if I select a URL in the pane on the left, then in the pane on the top right, it will tell me different stuff about the request. So in the inspector I have open there is showing me headers, but I could also just look at the text of the request and response. Now the window down in the bottom, and also at the top if I chose the request builder tab, I can then take a request that's already been sent or a response that's come back, and I can modify it. So I can open it up in a text editor or a hex editor or an XML editor, and I can change things subtly about it, and then choose to refeed it. So it will be resent to the client, or a slightly changed request can be resent to the server. And so I can intercept a call as it's going, change it slightly, and rerun it, which is really useful for debugging. And this app is obviously a little less nerdy than Ethereal. It's fairly easy to understand once you've got your head around the basics, and it just lets you read and modify the request or modify the response and resend it, which really speeds up debugging. But beyond just looking at the traffic, it's sometimes pretty useful to understand what's going on inside your code. If you know that if your client's sending the right request, or certainly if the server's sending the right response for the right request, then we know if any bugs then we know that any bugs that we're experiencing are probably somewhere in the client. So we want to look around in our client code, see what's going on. In the olden days, of course, old days being a couple of years ago, we had to be content with using alert and a lot of patience. So we'd stick alert statements in, and okay, the code has got up to here, and this value is as we expected. In these enlightened days, we have proper debuggers. So anyone who's an engineer for slightly older school computing will be familiar with debuggers and how useful they can be when debugging applications. And now we have proper debuggers for building JavaScript-based apps and AJAX-based apps. Visual Studio, Microsoft's Visual Studio, their developer environment, there's a free version called Visual Studio Express, or it's called Visual Studio Web Developer Express Edition, the web one. You can get it online there. It's free and it contains a really good debugger, obviously for debugging IE only. It's a full debugger environment, so it has stuff like watch lists, so you can say, here's the name of my variable. When I stop the page at a certain point, tell me what it contains, or set breakpoints in code, or do stack tracing so that you can see where your flow of execution's gone. So it's a full-on debugger environment, but for JavaScript, and you can halt your page at any time by putting a statement in your code, or by typing, I think, JavaScript : break into the address bar, and it will create a breakpoint at that point, and you can step into your code and step through it and step over and all the usual kind of debugger fluff. But this only works for IE. It's Visual Studio. It's quite a beast to install. It's several hundred megs download. It's pretty slow as well, even if very pretty. On the other side of the coin, small, fast, not pretty at all, is Venkman, which is the Mozilla debugger, which you can use with Firefox. You can get it at Mozilla projects. It's completely free and it's open source. It really is quite ugly, as we'll see in a moment. It's very recently become available for Firefox 1.5 as well. So if you're running 1.5 instead of the 1.0 series, then you can run Venkman. Venkman is a fully featured debugger, not quite as fully featured as Visual Studio, but still has everything you'd need. Here's the main Venkman window. It shows the code that's running in the right-hand pane, and you can set breakpoints, and you can do watches, and you can do stack traces, and all the kind of core debugger stuff. And Venkman is free for download, and you just install it as a Mozilla extension. And at any point, you can choose to set a breakpoint in your code and go into the debugger and see what's going on. So one of the problems with AJAX-based apps, when we receive a response from the server and we create some kind of content on the fly to show a user response, is that we manipulate the DOM to create new elements as we're running. So we don't always know what kind of state the source of the page is in. So it's not like we can view source and see exactly what's going on, because we have created new elements and inserted new tags and deleted old tags in the time the page has been running. So we need a kind of new variety of tools to help us introspect these pages and see what the source is going on, to help us introspect the DOM as pages are running. So I've added a tag on Flickr, and it's added it to the list of tags, and I need to see kind of what tags have been what HTML tags and elements have been added, and what's going wrong if there's a problem there, or what's going right if I want to copy that behavior. In Firefox, this is fairly easy. When you do an install, you just use there's Express or custom installation. If you choose custom install, then you can choose to install the developer extensions, which is like a couple of megs. And it adds an option on the tools menu down here for the DOM inspector. There are a bunch of other debugging tools I've got on my tools menu as well, but the DOM inspector is there, and it's Control-Shift-and-I, and it pops it up at any time when you have a page open. It looks a little bit like this. It's in keeping with all the Mozilla tools. It's pretty ugly, and they don't put a nice interface on it, but it does roughly what you need to just introspect the DOM, although not necessarily in a very easy way to grok when you look at it initially. It gives you a tree view of everything in the page, all of the text elements and the element elements, and you can scroll through those. So I've selected a div here on the left, and then it can show you all kinds of properties of that div in the right-hand pane. Right now I've got it on computed style, so it's showing me the style sheet elements that have all cascaded and are in effect at this moment. So I know that the clear is none and the cursor is auto. I'm not sure, and that this div happens to have a background URL, which is images/dotted.gif. So I can look through anything in the tree, and this is easy enough to traverse, apart from if you have a very large page, and then finding the elements you want can be a little bit tricky. So you don't tend to intuitively think about your pages of HTML as a big hierarchy of tags, or you do, but it's a little bit difficult to browse through them in a tree like this. IE has some better tools, perhaps just because it's more viable to create commercial tools for IE, or just because it's been around as a little stabler for a long time. So there's some really cool apps. The IE Instant Source Viewer lets you drag select anything on a page, and then it pops up a dialog showing the HTML source. So it shows HTML tags as if you had typed in the source to show that page statically. So if you add tags on the fly, you'll do it through document.elementCreate, but then it will show it up as an actual angled bracket tag. So you can really get a good visual idea of what your source would look like for elements created on the fly. So that's the IE Instant Source Viewer. IE DOM Inspector is very similar to the Mozilla DOM Inspector. Just shows you a good kind of view of the DOM, a tree view. And the IE Developer Toolbar and DOM Explorer, which comes from Microsoft, is a little integrated pair of apps. The one down at the bottom is a DOM inspector, but lets you quite nicely hover over elements you want to select. So the blue outline on the page here is because I've hovered over that element, so it shows me the DOM properties down at the bottom, which is pretty easy for getting to the elements you want, rather than having to dig through the tree to find them. I've also got the Dev Toolbar installed, which does lots of other useful things related to validation and CSS and images and all that kind of stuff. It also allows you to quickly get into the DOM viewer. So that's free for install. All of the apps I'm talking about here are free. You can get that from Microsoft.com, and the URL's in these slides. So talking about actual AJAX in real life use in situations. So we use it in Flickr. You could build whole applications in AJAX. So you just load one page and everything's there, and then you're there forever. You load everything asynchronously, and you build elements into the page as you go. There are some drawbacks to this kind of approach, apart from the fact you end up with a big monolith of an application. And it's difficult to necessarily develop. There are other drawbacks. So you don't end up with URLs for resources unless you use tricks with the fragment and breadcrumbs. And resources for URLs are important. If Flickr didn't have clean URLs for each photo, then people wouldn't be able to deep link into it, and it wouldn't do nearly so well. It wouldn't be interesting. And smashing everything into a single interface quickly gets ugly. To be able to put, well, depending on the scope of your application, but putting everything onto one page quickly gets difficult to design from a UI perspective, and also to just develop once you have this one monolithic code base. So as it's used today, AJAX tends to be used in kind of bits all over the place, little pieces. So Flickr's big usage of it to begin with was in kind of aiding click-to-edit functionality. So instead of, if I see the title of a photo, instead of click on a link to go to a page to edit it, and then type in the new title, and then click save and go back to the original page. So I avoid those two round trips by just allowing me to click on it, It becomes editable in place. I edit it, I click save, and it gets saved in place. So I avoid two-page round trip. So we just do this simple click-to-edit functionality. And then for larger apps, and this has been the case with Google Maps or different parts of Gmail, we can create small AJAX applications which just fulfill a single task. So do a couple of things, do one or two things, and do them well in one place. And then things which naturally seem to the user like an application which they wouldn't want to deep link into. So within Flickr, we have something called Organizer. And it's currently built, the current release version is built in Flash, but there's one being developed in AJAX at the moment. And this just brings together a couple of core pieces of functionality that people wouldn't want to be able to link into. So it allows people to create sets and groups of photos. And because it's just so limited in its scope, because it's only for creating a set of photos, people don't need to bookmark things into this, bookmark to within the task. So I don't need to be able to send my friend a link of the middle of me creating a set of photos. I just care about the URL of the set of photos that comes out of it. So we can bundle up this functionality together in an application, and it doesn't matter that it's not addressable, that we don't have URLs addressing into it, and it's not so big that it's too big a piece to design. It's a single instance application within a larger application. So we can build this whole thing in AJAX, which is and the AJAX version will be released shortly, but will probably look pretty similar to this Flash version. And the Flash version here uses the same technique. It uses asynchronous requests to pull in photos and to build sets and to organize sets and all of the features that that this mini application provides. So I've only got another 10 minutes or so. I'm going to quit talking about AJAX a little bit and talk about Web 2.0 in general. Web 2.0 is obviously very popular at the moment. There was the big Web 2.0 conference last year, and then or the year before, and an even bigger one this year. And everyone's talking about Web 2.0. Jeff had it in very big letters. Mine aren't quite so big, but it's still very important. Web 2.0 isn't all about AJAX, despite the fact that most of the tracks in this conference are about AJAX. It's about a lot more than AJAX. Web 2.0 isn't AJAX, and AJAX isn't Web 2.0. They're quite different things. And I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe 5 things we can learn from Web 2.0, or what people are calling Web 2.0, and how we can apply it to other things. Just 5 simple principles. So, and 5 simple principles that Flickr is kind of congregated around. So the first one is collaboration. We embrace collaborative metadata. That is allowing users to add metadata to other users' data. So instead of creating a ghetto for each user where they see their content and that's it, we open it up so users can see each other's content, and so that they can add metadata to them in the forms of tags and notes and comments and groupings. So we get the bottom-up organization of tags, and we drive user participation. Users are excited about using Flickr because they can see their friends' photos, but not only see them, but they can comment on them. And so that people can interact around user data, and they can collaborate. So collaborative metadata is important. We don't just allow users to see other users' content, we allow them to interact with them. And in that interaction, we store the metadata around that interaction, and that builds our data without users having to explicitly enter it. So if I add a comment on somebody's photo, it's because I want to add a comment on their photo, but we can infer a relationship out of that. You care about that photo, or you care about that person. So we get that kind of bottom-up data that people aren't explicitly giving us data, and we're not asking for it, but we end up receiving it, and we can infer relationships out of it. So in the case of, this is my friend Tom has a photo here, and there are some tags on it, but it's not my photo, but I can still add a tag. So if I notice that it has Phil and Jack Schultz, and I notice that it also has another person in it, I can add that tag. Or if I want to add a tag for some other reason, I notice the restaurant they're in, and I add that tag. So I can do that. And that builds relationships as well as building the kind of general bottom-up taxonomy of the site. Second, aggregation. So lots of sites already have a really rich array of data that they can use, but aren't using it, or aren't using it to their fullest extent that they can. So aggregation is largely about using the data that you already have. So if we think of Flickr as this huge cloud of data, of photos and metadata, think about ways that we can cut through it, interesting ways that we can aggregate different views together. So that's If we talk about we have the tag views, and we have the cluster views, and we have group views, and we have views by time, and views by other aspects. So different ways which we can cut through the old data, new views on old information. So lots of sites have a lot of data already, but are just presenting it, this is the data for this user, this is the data for this user. So Flickr tried to open that up and create interesting ways to cut through the same old block of data. So one of the newer parts of Flickr is the Explore section, in which we use general or various algorithms at the back end to pull out things which we think might be interesting for various reasons. And this is all kind of bottom-up data, so we look at people's activities around photos or around groups and around sets, and we aggregate together things that might be interesting. So this is, on the far left, is the most interesting photo from a year ago today, and we show that daily on the Explore page, just to kind of give people an interesting way into into certain content that they wouldn't have had in before. So we just present a new view on old data that we've had for a while, a year in this case. Thirdly, open APIs has been a big part of Web 2.0 and is going to continue to be probably a big part of the web until it all collapses and we go back to using analog telephones. It'll be fantastic. But until then, open APIs are a big thing. So one of the big things with open APIs that we talked about a couple of years ago was that you can help third-party developers to help you. So we created the Flickr APIs, and people go and build applications on top of Flickr because they're interested in the application or they think they can do exciting things, and then that helps Flickr. So every time somebody builds a cool application around Flickr and gets a few thousand users and people are really talking about it, they're also talking about Flickr, and people are signing up and using our application. And developers come up with ideas that we wouldn't have thought of, and they have time that we don't have to go and create little cool ideas or little niche apps around our app. And open APIs, by developing a clear API for the public, also means that you have an API which you can use internally for your AJAX stuff. So you have to have some kind of server component which your AJAX calls are calling into. So if you're building open APIs for the public, then you can build your website on top of those open APIs, the AJAX portions. And indeed, all of the AJAX within Flickr just uses our public APIs. So we design the APIs first, and then we can easily build the AJAX client apps on top of it. And there's no extra server work involved in creating the AJAX portions of Flickr. We've already done that work for the open APIs. And then people go and build really cool apps on top of it. So I forget what this app's called. Flickr Graph? Yeah. It's built on top of the APIs. It's an interesting kind of, it does a spider diagram of your contacts, and you can navigate around them. And then, so I'm drilling down to a friend of mine here, Tom, and I can look at some of his latest photos and see his latest tags, just in an interesting interface. And I can click on other people's floating heads. If this was a live demo, then they'd all be floating about in a kind of springy manner. And this drives participation. So people are using people using this app, they're using Flickr by extension. So it drives participation, and open APIs encourage remix and reuse of your data. People are going to use your data, build apps on top of it. So there's interesting stuff like this, and there's Mapper, which Jeff showed with the map and pulling photos on top of it. And there've been hundreds of apps built on top of the Flickr APIs in the last year or so. Number 4 out of the 5, I think. So Unicode. This is a little kind of left field compared to the other 4. Aim for internationalization and localization ability from the outset when developing an application. This is a little nerdier in the level below, but when building applications, which can be large or public applications with large metadata or large communities, don't forget the rest of the world. There's only so many of us who speak English, and we're outnumbered by the rest of the world. They will soon take over. So don't forget them. It's pretty easy if we develop from the beginning to allow internationalization. If we're using UTF-8 at the client side, then it makes our life down the road when we go to localize a lot easier. So Flickr's all based around Unicode, and there's very little work which needs to be done at the front end on the client side. Just a little bit of work around how we send requests. And then we can end up with the fantastic stuff that we see on Flickr all the time, where people come and join in because they happen to speak English as well, but can use the site and the application in their own language. So people will post all different kinds of crazy character sets they don't understand, and have conversations and have little communities within Flickr who can speak and use whichever language they like. And in fact, I think now there's something like 40 different language guides to Flickr that have been created by users in the community, where they'll create a guide to using the English language site in their own language so anyone can come along and use it. And these, in fact, these guides tend to be much, much better than our own help guides, where they'll write an 100-page document on how to use Flickr, and our help guide's about 4 pages. So, but if you give people the tools to be able to use your application, then they can use it. There's so many more people who don't use an English character set than do. So just by allowing, by thinking about Unicode from the beginning and making sure we just support all these character sets, which is very little work at the front end, then we're allowing ourselves a much bigger audience. So it's well worth doing. Number 5, last one, almost finished, open content. Flickr allows you to license your content under the Creative Commons, as well as the basic license under Flickr when you upload photos is all rights reserved, in that the person who uploads the photo owns the photo, which was a little bit of a change from the other photo sites at the time, where when you upload a photo, the photo site owns the photo and can use it however they want, which is a little bit evil. So by default, if I upload a photo to Flickr, I own it. But I can also apply Creative Commons license to it and let other people use my content for different stuff. So you can say, I want it to be used, it must not be used commercially, but anyone else can use it, or people can't make derivatives of it. And there are various Creative Commons licenses, and you can go to creativecommons.org to find out more about that. But it allows people to use content outside of your application and turns your application into a resource. So as Jim was saying earlier, Flickr's become like a huge resource of photos. It's just a huge usable resource of photos. And people can go, lots of people now will go to Flickr and do a search there before they'll do an image search on Google or Yahoo, because you're more likely to find images that you can actually use because they're photos, and they're often licensed. And having open content allows us allows people to create products like this series of posters done by one of our users, taking Flickr photos and putting them into posters and then selling them. All of these photos were Creative Commons licensed, and they're all out of a group called Circle Squared, who are people who take photos of circular things. And so there was this really interesting series of photos and people could produce posters, and there's also been songs and videos around Flickr that people have done using Creative Commons content so that people can distribute it without worrying that the photo owners are going to go off and sue them at some point. So open content is the 5th of our principles. That was collaboration, aggregation, open APIs, Unicode, and open content. Any questions? I probably don't really have time for questions, I'm afraid, because it's already past, but that man has one.
When Flickr's getting a massage, are you doing the massaging?
Yeah, I'm the principal massager for Flickr when Flickr is having a massage. That's true.
Are you debugging it? Is that what's going on?
Usually when Flickr's having a massage, it's a hardware replacement or something, some kind of core operation like that. Software-wise, we stay up 100% of the time, but we have hardware issues cause downtime, if anything. Last question, sorry. Okay, so moderation and content moderation, I can't really talk about that, I'm afraid. And so that's...
How does interesting this work?
These slides are available online from the conference website at some point, as soon as I give them to you, and also online at my website, so you can pick them up there to get any of the URLs out of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cal. Cal Henderson from Flickr. Well, I was kind of hoping that we would get the secret sauce behind interestingness, but just have to keep trying. Just have to keep taking more interesting photos. It's lunchtime, and we will resume with the afternoon sessions at 2 o'clock. Lunch is to your left and to your left again, about a 20-minute walk away.